What's good, YouTube? Welcome to another Small James coding tutorial where today we're going to be looking at how we can build a web page with HTML, CSS, and use JavaScript to interact with the document object model to make our page dynamic and interactive. So the application we're going to be building today is this lyrical app where basically we have a form where we can input lyrics. So let's say, for example, this is a song that we like. We can copy all of these lyrics just like that straight into here. And now we can click learn, and it's going to take us to this page where we can basically try ourselves on the lyrics. So let's say I didn't know the lyrics. I can click the lyrics. It's going to show us them here. So a lazy rain am I, the skies refuse to cry. So a lazy, oh, I got it wrong. Rain am, nope, am I. New line, the skies, what is it? Refuse. You get the idea. And then when you're finished, it takes you back to the start. You can reset it off the top. You can show the lyrics, scroll down, and you can go back to the home page. So it's a super cool app. Teaches all the fundamentals of document object manipulation and the model and HTML, CSS, and how to use it all with JavaScript. If you enjoy the video, please like and sub. Let's get into it. So you've seen what we're going to be building. The first thing we're going to do is start off in an empty project directory in our Visual Studio Code editor. And in here, we are going to create a new file, and that's going to be an index.html file. So the index is basically the file that gets served up by default for these kind of projects, and the HTML is the suffix for a hypertext markup language document. And in here, what we're going to do is use the exclamation key to generate the boilerplate code for a default basic HTML document. So from here, what we can do is use the live server extension to open this up with live server. So if you're in Visual Studio Code, you can come in here and just type in live server. Installing this top feature here will allow you to right click on your document, go open with live server. And that's just going to open up a page here that live refreshes any changes that it sees reflected in the body of this document. So for example, if I type in James, we can see that James appears in our live web page. And so effectively, just like that, you now have a website that has HTML running in it. So the second thing we're going to do is just do some project initialization stuff. And so that begins with a style tag in here. And we're just going to select every particular element in our HTML and give it a box sizing of border box, a padding of 0, and a margin of 0, and this kind of just resets the default margin and padding and box sizing for all of our elements. As you can see in here, we actually have a default padding, and so when I save this, our live server refreshes, and so now we just sit hard up in that top corner. The next thing we're going to need for this particular project is some Google Fonts, and so for that I'm going to open up this web page and just type in Google Fonts, if I can actually spell, which I clearly can't. So we're going to come into Fonts here and click on Fonts. And for this particular project, I'm going to be using 3 fonts, but you can kind of pick whichever ones you like. The first one is going to be Poppins, and so I'm going to scroll down a little bit, just select a couple of the basic styles. So 400 is probably good for that. The next one we're going to need is Work Sans. So we're going to do the same thing there, get the 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500. And then the last one we're going to get for the header is Rock 3D. So if I come 3, but it actually doesn't have it here. However, we're going to use a secret to get it in a second. Now what I'm going to do from there is in this link tag, I'm going to copy these 3 links and come into my document, and just under where it has title, I'm going to paste them in. I can close that for the minute, auto format. So now we have those 3 link tags inside of the head tag just here. And now what I'm going to do is just in front of the family equals work, I'm just going to type and family equals rock plus 3D. And this is going to be the final font that we need for our project. So now we can see the effects of these font imports by coming into here and selecting our body, for example, and saying font family rock 3D, and we should see this updated to our new font just up there, and we can see that it has indeed. So that is absolutely perfect. Now This style tag is going to contain the stylings for our particular document, and the way that styles works, if you're not already familiar, or CSS styles in particular, is the style selects a particular tag or element, HTML element, and applies the styles within it to that element here. So in this particular case, we have this HTML element, and then in the style tag, we select that element and we can apply a style. So we're saying set the font family of this element to this particular state here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the asterisk sets everything, and the other thing we're going to set in here is the scroll behavior property, and we're just going to set it to smooth so that the scrolling is always smooth. And with those two things done, we're actually pretty good to start building out the HTML for our particular document. So for Lyrical, the first thing we're going to need is a header 1 tag that actually has the word Lyrical in it. And you can obviously name that whatever you want, but I'm going to keep it like that. And while we're there, we can probably actually update the title to also say that, Lyrical. So that will just change it from document to Lyrical up there. And now underneath that, we're going to need a form. And inside of our form, we're going to need a text area input. And this is going to have an autocomplete attribute as off. Type equals text. ID equals search input. Placeholder equals lyrics. ... just like that. Now we can close that. That should pop up on our page just there. Perfect. And then after that, we're just going to need an input type equals submit. So that's just going to submit our document. So it's essentially a button. We're going to give it the value equals learn. Just like that within our things. I'm going to capitalize it. And the last thing is going to be giving that an ID of submit button. And so now I can save that. And so we have honestly, basically all the HTML that we actually need for our page. The next thing we want to do is obviously make it look pretty. So to make it look pretty, the first thing we're going to start off is with our body. And we're going to give this a min height 100% of the view height. We're going to give it a display of flex for all its children. We're going to give it a flex direction of column. Otherwise, everything would be lined horizontally, so we need it to be lined vertically. We're also going to align items in the center of the page so that everything is centered, just like that. We're going to have a background color of hashtag 0F172A. So everything now will go very dark. And finally, we're just going to have a color of white so that all the text is white. So that's our page. The next thing we're going to style is our H1 tag, the header just there, and that's pretty simple. So we've already set the font family up here. This font family is actually going to want to be specific to our H1 tag. And instead, in our body, we're going to set the font family to work sans, and we're going to give it a backup of sans serif, and we should probably do that for the Rock 3D as well. So the second after the comment is the backup font, so sans serif. Now we can add a font sizing to make it a little bit bigger, so we're going to go with 3 rem, bump that up a bit. We're also going to say user select is none, so that there's no text selection. And we're going to give it a padding of, specifically the top, of 20 pixels. So that's just going to push it down a little bit. Now, we're initially going to be designing for a mobile page, so we're just going to use this smaller screen here to make sure that works properly. And the last thing we're going to do on this particular one is set a transition duration of 250 milliseconds, because we're going to make it interactive by having a hover effect. So for the hover effect, all we're going to do is set a text shadow, so it's going to make the text glow, and it's going to be 0 vertically and 0 horizontally and 3 pixels blur, and we're just going to give it a color of cyan. And so now when you hover over it, we can see that it's just absolutely going to glow, and it just looks super like neon and fun. The other thing we could probably actually just do is give it a cursor pointer, so now when people hover over it, they know that it will have some effect that we will add later. After our H1, we're going to select the form element, and we're going to give that some style. So that's also going to have a display of flex. So that's going to apply to these two particular items here. And currently they're side by side, however we want one on top of another, so we're going to go flex direction column, so it lines things in a column instead. We're also going to give it a width of 450 pixels and a maximum width of 80% of the view width. So that means that it will set this default width until this governing condition takes over, and then it will never be any more than 80% of the view width. So that's just going to keep it nice and within our page. We're also going to give it a gap of 20 pixels and a padding of 30 pixels vertically and 0 horizontally, and finally a flex of 1, which will make it take up the whole screen. So now we can see that it's 80% of the view width up to a maximum of 450, and then it's centered. So that's our form, and then the next thing is we're going to select the input within the form, and we're going to select the text area within the form. So this just means select the input that is within a form. And in here we're going to give it an outline of none, so that should remove the outline, just like that. We're going to go also border of none. Color is going to be white. Padding of 8 pixels vertically and 6 pixels horizontally. A text transform to uppercase. And that should do it for those default styles. And now we're going to use the ID selector to select the element with the ID of search input. Now keep in mind that the ID, any ID within your HTML should be a unique ID. You cannot double up, so this will only target a singular element, and we can use the pound key to look for an element that has that particular ID. So we can open that up. That's going to have a background of transparent, so that will go see-through. We're going to give it a border of 1 pixel solid transparent. You'll see why we do that in a second. We're going to say border bottom 1 pixel solid hashtag 0E7490. We're going to say a transition duration of 300 milliseconds, so that's how long any transition will take. A font size of 1.2 rem, font weight of 300. Height is going to be the size of the maximum content with a max height of 600 pixels. Resizable none, so that the user cannot resize, so that's going to remove that little element there. We're going to give it a position of relative, almost done, an overflow of auto, so that means if it's too large it will allow the user to scroll. A flex of 1, so that it takes up a majority of the content in the parent element, and a background of HSL 244 80% and 5%, so that's going to be pretty dark. And finally a border radius of 4 pixels. So all that style has just made this particular element look that particular way. So now on a big screen it comes up and it's responsive on smaller screens too. So that's pretty cool. The next thing we're going to do is apply some hover effects. So we're going to go search input and select the hover capability. And all we're going to do here is set the background to HSL 260, 80% and 7%, just like that. So now what we should be able to do is see that it gets slightly lighter. And you can see that it's not instantaneous, which just shows that our transition duration is working adequately. So the last thing we're going to do is set the focus state, because it is a text input. So when someone has selected on it, we want to apply a particular style, and so that is going to set the border, which is currently transparent, to 1 pixel solid cyan, and we're going to set the background to that same darker color as before, so it's going to be 260, 80% and 7%, just like that. So now when I save that and select this, we can see that the entire border is selected and it's a slightly lighter color, so that's just pretty neat. and I think it looks pretty excellent. So the next thing we're going to want to style is our button down there, because currently that looks definitely subpar. And so once again, we can select that by its ID down here. Notice that I actually haven't closed that tag, which is not so good. But yeah, so let's just open that up. So we want submit button is the ID. And in here, we're just going to give it a font weight of 300, a font size of 1 rem, a background. It's going to be a background color of, and this is going to be a linear gradient. So to the right, the first color is going to be 38BDF8, and the second color is going to be 2DD4BF. Just like that, save that, and that looks pretty. We're going to go a transition duration of 200 milliseconds, a cursor pointer letter spacing of 2 pixels to spread out the letters a bit, and a border radius of 1 pixel. And now what we can do is do the same submit button hover, and this time what we want to do is transform it, and we just want to scale it down to 0.97. And so what that's going to look like is now when we hover, it just gets a bit smaller. So all in all, that looks pretty good for our page so far. The last thing we want to do is make it look a bit different on bigger screens by bumping up the font sizes. And so what we can do is set a media query, and in here we can just say min width for these styles to apply is going to be 500 pixels. I like either 500 or 640, and typically it is best practice to go from smaller sizes first, and then inside of your media query add the styles for the larger page. And so in here I'm just going to say for the H1 we want a font size of 4.5 rem. For the search input, just like that, we want a font size of 1.7 rem. And finally for the search button, that's going to be a font size of 1.5 rem. So we can see that now as we come to a smaller page, it just naturally adjusts itself. And now we have this text input area where we can input our lyrics, and soon we'll be able to click learn, and it will take us to a secondary page that we'll get to in a minute. But to make all of that functionality happen, you know, currently if I click learn, nothing happens. And if I type in here and click learn, still the same thing. Even the page doesn't work. So what do we do? Well, now what we have to do is after our final form tag in here, we add what is a script. And so inside of the script, we can use JavaScript to perform operations or logic, and we can interact with a document object model, where the document object model is basically just our HTML in an object form, so that we can interact with it as if it were an object in JavaScript. And we will see exactly how that's done in a minute. So the first thing we're going to do is define 2 variables. The first one is going to be button, and that is going to refer to as the document.getElement by ID, and we're going to get it as submit button. So the document in this particular case is our document object, and we're calling a method that searches that document object for a tag that has the ID attribute of submit button. So now that we've got that and saved it to a variable button, we're going to get the text, which is going to be a similar process. So we're going to go document get element by ID. Equally, what you could do is say query selector all, or query selector and actually do pound search input, but I'm just going to stick with the get element by ID because the IDs are always unique. So we're going to go search input. And so what that's going to do is allow us to interact with those HTML input button, or the submit button, and the text area. And from there, what we can do is define an asynchronous function. So I'm just going to call that learn, and that's going to take an event. And in here, what we're going to do is use this to submit basically the text that we copy into our text input and send us off to a new page where we can go and learn all the stuff, which is super cool. So the first thing we're going to do in here is type e.prevent default. And you can see what the default behavior is to refresh the page. So every time I click, it just refreshes the page. So we want to prevent that refresh because then we'll just lose everything. The second thing we're going to do is say text.value equals nothing. So if it's an empty string, then we're just going to return and end the function there, because there's no point in learning lyrics if they haven't entered any lyrics to learn. After that, we know that there is lyrics. And so what we're going to do now is save the lyrics to local storage, because that's how we're going to communicate it between the two pages. So we can save it to local storage in this particular page and then access the lyrics from the local storage on our second page. So here I can say local storage.set item, and the first thing we pass is a key, and so the key is going to be, lyrical, just like that. Most likely going to be unique. And the next thing we want to pass is the lyrics. And so I'm just going to define the lyrics here. So const lyrics is equal to, and it's going to be the text.value. So whatever value is saved inside of this text input is going to be set to our lyrics. So in here, I can just pass in lyrics, just like that, and that should actually work. So I should be able to test that if I open up the local storage application. Here we can see local storage. Currently there's nothing. If I just click learn, nothing happens. If I enter, nothing happens. And that's actually because the next thing we have to do is actually interact with our document object model, and we have to assign this function to our submit button. So we need to make it so that on our submit button, when a user clicks it, it runs this particular function. And so we can make this document object manipulation by just saying button.add event listener. So it's listening for a particular event. It's a click or submit event. Both should work in this particular case. And we're just going to add the learn function. So now once again, if I refresh this page, just like that, and click learn, we don't get that refresh anymore. Currently we're not setting a key, which is good because we shouldn't. There's no text. But now if I add hello and click learn, we can see that we've added the value hello to the key lyrical, and that is saved in our local storage. And if I refresh that page, that is still there. Even if I close it and open it, it's saved to our storage. And so that's how we're going to access it in the next page that we'll develop in a second. Now, since that is all well and good, the other thing we just want to do after we set the local storage is to set the text.value equal to nothing so that it resets it. And then we want to navigate our users to the second page. And so we can do that by accessing the window property. So that's the current window that we're in, and we can say location. That's not right. Location.href, which is the current link that we're at. So currently that would say whatever is up there. We want to now set it to /songs. So /songs currently doesn't exist in a page, but all we would have to do is add a new document in here, songs.html, or I guess it more specifically would be song.html. Do the exclamation key, enter that in, and we can just in here say, hello, this is a song. And we could also add a script tag at the bottom that just console.logs local storage.getItem lyrical. And so that will retrieve whatever value is saved at that particular key, so in the lyrical key. So now we should be able to try this out, and this actually does not need to be an asynchronous function. But actually, the one other thing I'm just going to do before we do anything is run one other check that just says if local storage.getItem lyrical exists already, then we actually want to just redirect. So we can say window.location.href is equal to /song. Now you can see that that redirect worked properly because this script was run when the page was refreshed, and it found something in our local storage in it, so it set our location to song. But for whatever reason, now the reason it did not find anything, whereas realistically it should find song.html, is just because we actually need to specify that that's an HTML document. So I can change both of these just like that. And now if I go back to our home page, it redirects us to this particular document. And we should see in the console that we do indeed console.log the value that was saved in our local storage. So that's just how we're going to communicate between these two pages, communicate the lyrics between the first page and the second page in this particular case. Now I should mention that this will also work on mobile devices and everything, so that is all good. And it also represents the end of our first page just here. That is all finished. So now coming into our second page just here, there are a few things that we're going to have to do that are very similar to the first page, and the first thing is just copy all of these link tags just here. Well, actually, I guess we'll just do it independently. So in here, what we're going to do is start off by changing the title once again to lyrical, because it's the same thing. We're going to open up a style tag just like that. We're going to input that set of styles just there, and we're also going to copy these 3 link tags and just paste them directly under our title so that we can apply those fonts. The next thing we're going to do is start changing our body or writing out our HTML. And so in here, what we can do is start off with our same h1 tag as before. So I can just go ahead and copy and paste that. As you might expect, we actually have the exact same body and h1 style. So we can go ahead and copy all of that across too. Now you might be inclined to tell me that it doesn't seem very efficient to duplicate the code, and that's where JavaScript frameworks can be great for this, but just for plain HTML sake, that's what we're going to do. So now we already have that header all working on both pages. So if I just come back to our home page, it's still going to redirect us to song.html, so that's all good. Now everything else is a little bit different, but the first thing we're going to start off adding is a form element, if I can spell. And just in here, the first thing we're going to have is an input type equal text. That should be type. And we're going to have an ID of input, just like that. Self-closing tag. And then we're also going to have a button with ID equal to reset just underneath. And that's going to say reset just like that. So those two things should pop up on our screen. After the form, we're going to have a div or division that just has lyrics, the word inside it. And this is going to have an ID equal to show, and this is going to be for our modal. We're also going to have a div with the ID equal to modal, and that's going to be empty. You will see why soon. And so these last two divs are specifically for adding a modal, which is a dynamic HTML element, and that is where using JavaScript to interact with the document object model is super fundamental to getting that functionality to work nicely. And I lied, there's actually going to be one div inside of here that just has an ID equal to exit, and the words exit. That's going to allow the user to exit the modal when we program that in. So now we can get into styling our particular form. So just down here, I'm going to select the form tag. And the first thing I'm going to do is give it a flex of 1. So if I save that, it pushes everything else to the bottom and it occupies this entire flex space. The flex number just gives it priority, where the lower number is a higher priority. It itself is going to have a display of flex, a flex direction of column. We're going to justify the content center and also align the items center so everything is perfectly centered in the page. Now we're going to give it a gap between the elements or the children elements of 30 pixels, a maximum width of 80% of the view width, a position of relative. We're going to align the content also in the center. Now the next thing we're going to select is the input within the form, and this is also going to have an outline of none, a background of inherit, so inherits its parent background. We're going to give it a padding of 8 pixels and 10 pixels. It's going to have a text transform of uppercase so that everything is turned into uppercase, a border of none, color white, font size 2 rem border 1 pixel solid transparent, just like before. Border bottom 1 pixel solid cyan. Text align center to push the text into the center. We can see those changes coming in on the side there, looking pretty good. We're going to give it a border radius of 2 pixels, font weight of 200, letter spacing of 2 pixels, and finally a transition duration of 300 milliseconds. Now, anywhere between typically 200 to 300 is pretty optimal, so it's just up to you, whatever your preference is. Finally, we're going to go for the form and the input within the form, and we're going to add an onHover event to that particular input. Actually, I lie, that is meant to say focus. It's going to be the focus event. And in here, just like before, it's going to be a border of 1 pixel solid cyan and a box shadow of 0, 0, 2 pixel spread, 1 pixel blur, also cyan. So now when we select that, it will glow real pretty. After that, we're going to select the show element. So we're going to use the pound to select the show. I should mention that if you're using a class, you use the bullet point instead of the pound. But now we can target this particular div by its ID, and we're just going to say margin bottom of 10 pixels. Cursor pointer, because it's a button. User select none so that no one can select the text in the button. Transition duration of 300 milliseconds. And this is also going to have a font family similar to the header of Rock 3D and a backup of sans serif, just like that. So that's our little lyrics button down the bottom. Now we're also just going to say show and select the hover property. So when we hover over it, and we're just going to say text shadow 004 pixel cyan, and we're also going to say transform scale, and we're going to go 1.06 times by the original scale. So now when it hovers, we just get that little shadow and it gets a bit bigger. Just for the sake of showing you how you could do this if it was a class, I'm also just going to change that to class equals to modal, and now we can style the modal the exact same way. So I'm going to use the period to select a particular class. You can have multiple classes that are the same, so I could also add the class of modal up here, but that would look weird because the styles aren't relevant. But anyway, this is going to have a position of absolute. We're going to give it a transition duration of 300 milliseconds, an inset of 0, so that just means top, left, right, and bottom are all 0, so it fits snug to the border of the page. It's going to have a dark background of hashtag 0F172A, our favorite color. We're going to go a Z index of 10 so that it sits above the content. A higher Z index sits higher or above elements or in front of other elements with lower Z indexes. We're going to give it an initial opacity of 0, but I'm going to comment that out for a second so that we can actually see it. We're going to go pointer events none so that every click goes through it. It doesn't recognize clicks. More specifically, if you click on it, the background element will get recognized as the click. We're going to have a display of grid instead of flex. Place items center, so that's just going to put everything smack bang in the center of the page. We're going to have a user select none and overflow of auto so that information allows us to scroll if it overflows the div side. And finally, a padding of 20 pixels vertically and 4 pixels horizontally. So that's the modal. So now we can actually see the modal because we can't see anything else. Now if I make that opacity 0, it goes away and we can see our regular page because it's invisible. The click events will actually work behind this modal because its pointer events are set to none. So the next thing we have to style is our exit button. So that's the one that has the div ID exit. And now this is going to have a position of fixed on the page, and it's going to be a top of 0 and a right of 0. So that should put it in the top right, just over there like that. And that's going to stay there no matter how we scroll on the page. Then what we're going to do is set the color to white, although it already is. A text shadow to 006 pixels cyan, and we're going to add a second one of 002 pixels cyan, just like that. So now that's got a pretty complete glow on it. We're going to go cursor pointer because it's going to be a button. A font size of 1 rem, a display of grid, place items, also center in the center of the div. Then we're going to have a padding all around of 4 pixels, just like that. And finally, a transition duration of 200 milliseconds. And a Z index of 10. So that's the actual element. Now we want to give it some hover properties. So we're going to add that little hover in there. And in here, we're just going to say the color is cyan. So currently it's white. Whereas when you hover, it's actually going to make it slightly darker and set it to cyan. And the reason it's actually not working is once again because of that pointer events, but we will get to that in a second. So the last button that we want to do is our reset button, and I'm just going to come open that up for the minute. So that's all gone. So our reset button is just here. We're going to once again select that using the ID selector, so reset. Now I can say margin 0, vertically, horizontally auto, so it's always centered. We're going to say background is transparent. We're going to do dash WebKit dash text dash fill color to white. And we're going to say dash WebKit text stroke, which I actually can't see, WebKit text stroke to cyan. So you'll see what that does in a second. We also have to set a width, which is going to be 1 pixel cyan, so that now glows. This is just how you can do a text outline without actually finding a text that is only outline. We're going to have a letter spacing of 2 pixels, a padding of 3 pixels vertically, 5 pixels horizontally. Then we're going to give it a border of none because that looks atrocious. Gone. A cursor of pointer because it's going to be a reset button. Font weight of 300. Text shadow of 003 pixels cyan. Font size 0.6 rem. And finally a margin bottom of 10 pixels. I also forgot a transition duration. Can't forget that. I'm going to go 250 milliseconds. So now what we want to do is for this, add the hover effect. And just for the demonstration, we're going to, in this particular case, set the opacity to 0.7. So 1 is full. So now when I hover, it becomes less opaque, more invisible. And finally, once again, we'll do our media for our min screen size. So min width is 500 pixels, same as the other one. And in here, once again, it's just about setting the font sizes. So exit becomes font size of 1.7 rem. Dot modal is going to be bigger padding. So we're going to go 40 pixels, 10 pixels horizontally. And same for the body. We're just going to add a padding of 100 pixels vertically and 10 pixels horizontally. So that's now our new form. None of it works, obviously, but that's what we're looking at. And in here, what we want is to now, once again, use the JavaScript with document object model to make it functional. So here we have a little text input that looks nice and neat. The text goes from the center. And how this is going to work is the box will be a good color if the latest letter or if the entire sentence so far matches the actual lyric from your head. And you can check the lyrics by clicking on this and it will open up the lyrics. So to achieve this, the first thing we're going to do is set an if statement that says if local storage dot get item lyrical, doesn't exist. So if it's just an empty string, then we want to send the user back to the main page where they can enter the lyrics. So we're going to go .location.href is just equal to the slash. And so now if I save that, for example, come in here, go to our application, local storage, and delete that, we can see that when I refresh the same page, so I'm not going back to the main page, I'm just refreshing the page, it now redirects us back to the main page because it couldn't find anything. So this doesn't exist, which means that the inverse of that returns true, which means this line here is run and we are redirected back to the main page. If that check is not found, then what we can do is start off by getting out our lyrics. So our lyrics are going to be equal to local storage.getItem lyrical. And the fact that we're not on the main page just shows that we do in fact have lyrics. The next thing we're going to do is target our modal element. In this particular case, we're going to use document, oh, don't want that, dot query selector, because we didn't use the ID, and we can just go dot for the period modal, so that should select our modal element. Now what we're going to do is set modal.innerHTML. So since the modal currently only contains this exit element, we need to add some inner HTML to it. So part of the document object model for each tag or element is that it will contain its children. So for example, if I were to target the form and print out its inner HTML, we would expect to see these two elements here. So instead what we're going to do the opposite is target that element and use JavaScript to add inner HTML. So we can just say is equal to whatever it currently is plus, and this is where I'm going to add some funky properties. So I'm going to use backtick so I can enter it out onto a new line. And now we can essentially write out HTML like we would otherwise. So I'm going to have a div, but in this particular case, I'm going to use the style attribute instead of an CSS style. So I'm going to use an inline style. So I can just say is equal to quotation. We're going to say text align as the property center. That's the first one. The next one is going to be text transform uppercase. I can close that for the second. The next one is going to be font family is equal to, we're going to use the little quotes because it has to be in quotations. We're going to say work sans. Font weight is, let's bring that down onto a new line. Font weight is going to be 100 and line height is going to be 1.5 rem, just like that. So now after that, I'm going to continue to add some more stuff. So I'm going to plus open up another set of backticks. And in this particular case, what I'm going to do is add in my lyrics dynamically. So if I can spell that right, lyrics. So inside of the backtick strings, if you use the $sign with the curly parentheses, you can add in a JavaScript variable or a string, and it will insert that string into this whole string. So that's added the whole string, and then finally what I have to do is just add a closing div, just like that, because this was our opening div just here, and that reminds me that after that I actually need to close that string and then add the little brace. And so this is just going to add this tag, and honestly it would be more clear if I just push that onto a new line, double tag that in there. And so here you can see that basically we have an opening div, a closing div, and inside we just have our lyrics. So what that's going to mean is that now if I come back up here and say these are my lyrics banana muffins, just like that, learn, we come to this page, currently there's nothing, but that's because we have an opacity set to 0. So if I can just find that on our modal and change that, we can see that now we're rendering our modal, and our JavaScript has modified the document object model to add in Basically, we've come through here, we've executed this line, gotten the lyrics, we've targeted our modal, and we've added the HTML to say that. So that is some great dynamic interaction. I'm just going to leave that invisible for the minute. So the next thing I'm going to do is come down here and say const lines are is equal to lyrics.split \n. And so what that's going to do is, I'll show you exactly what it does. In our text element, we're going to have some new line characters, and so we can actually split our large string of lyrics by the new lines characters to get the independent lines in an array. And so if I console.log lines array, just like that, and come in here and go console, currently we only get one array because we only have one thing. However, if I, once again, clear, let's say delete that, refresh the page, we go back to the main page, and in here I say a whole lot of things, enter a whole lot of things, a whole lot of things, and then say last line, and now we save this. And often when you enter lyrics, it's going to be line by line. Now if I come to this page and once again display the modal, so if I come up to the opacity, close that, well actually we don't even have to do that, we can just come straight into the console tab. We can see that now we get an array of all of the random new lines. And we can use that to make sure that they are entering lines line by line, if that makes any sense. So when you first start learning the song, we're going to say current index or the current line is equal to 0, so that's going to be the default. And we're also going to say let the current line equal to the lines array at the current index. So if the current index is 1, it's going to take the first element. Sorry, if the current index is 0, because it's the 0th element, it's going to take the string or the sentence at the very beginning. So now that we have targeted our lyrics, the next thing we're going to do is add some functionality to the buttons. And so we're going to start off by targeting the buttons. So we're going to have the home button just like that. And that is going to be document.query selector just like that. And if we just want to target an element just like we do in the CSS, we actually just don't use the pound or the bullets pound or the period, we just go for the element itself, and we can do that here. So we're going to target the h1 tag, which is this main tag, and now we're going to say home button dot add event listener, and it's going to be a click event, and here we're going to provide an arrow function that just clears the local storage. So we're going to say local storage.clear, and we're also going to say window.location.href is equal to main screen. And so now we should be able to reset that just by clicking that, add that, and so now we have full functionality in our page, which is excellent. That's not overflowing, is it? It is overflowing. We'll fix that in a second. Currently there's an overflowing feature, which is not what we want, but I believe the limiting element is just going to be because we haven't set the width. So just adding that 100% width in there fixed that overflow problem we were having. So now it will come up to that full size and not overflow the page. So that's cool. Yeah, but anyway, we can reset that and all that good stuff. So the next button we're going to do is the show modal button. So we're going to select that. So we're going to say show modal is equal to document.get element by ID. And in this particular case, we gave it the show ID. So that is the unique ID. And so now we can say show modal.add event listener. We also want it to listen for the click event, and on the click event, we want to target the modal. So const modal is equal to document.get element by ID. So we want to select the modal element, but in this particular case, it's going to be query selector because we don't have the ID set. So we can just say query selector and instead use the class, just like that. Now we're going to say modal.style, so we're going to access the style property of that particular tag in our document object model, and we're going to set the opacity within the style equal to 1, because currently it's 0. And we're going to say modal.style.pointer events, which we previously set to none, so all clicks went through to exit. And so now what's going to happen is when I click show, let's say I have lyrics in here, just like that. We click learn and I click lyrics, this shows, and you'll notice that our hover event also now works because the button is recognizing whatchamacallits, hover events or pointer events. So that's all good. The exit button does not work yet, which is what we're about to do. So we're going to say const exit is equal to document.getElementById exit, and we can just say exit dot add event listener is going to be once again a click event, and here we're just going to reverse the previous function. So we're going to say, we can actually just basically copy and paste this logic just there. So now it's going to be back to 0, and we're going to set that to none. So that should actually be our modal working perfectly. So now we can exit, go back to the page. We even get a nice gradual fade out because we added that transition duration. And then the last button is going to be const reset is equal to document.getElementById reset. And this is going to be resetting your progress. So we're going to say reset.add event listener. That's once again going to be the click event. Open that up. And we're just going to set the current index equal to 0, the current line is equal to lines array at the current index, and finally the input dot value equal to empty. So the input is going to be this input just here. Now we haven't yet defined input, which is going to be the next thing we do. So here we can say const input is equal to document.getElementById input. So that's going to select this ID input field here, and now we can say input.add event listener. This one's going to be different, so this is going to be on input. We want to run this logic. So there's a few things that we have to check here. We basically have to check that the most recently entered string, or the string that is currently in the input, matches the text from the lyrics up until for that many inputted characters. So the first thing we're going to do is say first check if the input has focus. And so we can do that by saying let typed characters, or I'm just going to call them chars, equal to the input which we selected just above, dot value dot to lowercase, which is just going to make it case insensitive. Then what we're going to do is get the input length. So input length is equal to typed chars dot length. So that's going to be the length of that particular string. And now what we're going to do is get the completed length, the completed characters, which is equal to the current line, which we've selected just up here. So that's the current line that we're on, dot slice, and I'm going to slice it from 0 up to the input length. So now I'm going to have two strings of equivalent length, one that is the typed characters and one that is the actual lyrics for that length. And so now we can do a direct check on them, and so we can say if typed chars dot to lowercase is equal to the current line, which in this particular case just suggests that they've actually finished a line, we can now do a secondary check which checks that if they're at the very bottom or end of the function. So we can say if the current index, which is the line that they're on, is equal to lines dot length, then we want to reset the entire function. So in this particular case, we can set the current index equal to 0 because they finished. Great success. We can set the current line equal to lines current index, or just 0. And finally, we can return, because we want to break out of this particular function and end everything, input.value is equal to an empty string. So just reset everything. So if that's not the case, then what we want to do is have a secondary if check, which checks completed characters not equal to typed chars.toLowercase. So if this is true, then that means they've made a mistake and one of the characters they've entered is incorrect. And in this particular case, what we want to do is go input.style.border color, just like this, is equal to transparent. So we're going to change the border color, and now we want to set the input.style.box shadow. So we're going to add a box shadow equal to 0, 0, 2 pixel spread, 1 pixel blur, hashtag E11D48. So that's going to be a reddish color, which says that they've done something wrong. And else, that means that it's been corrected. So that means that something is right, everything is still correct. So we're just going to say input.style.border color is equal to cyan. So we're going to set everything back to normal, and we're going to say input.style.box shadow is equal to 0, 0, 2 pixel, 1 pixel cyan. So back to the original color. And so just like that, we can see that that works, but now if I type P, that doesn't work. And that is because, and the reason that didn't work is actually because these two if checks just here, so I want to control X, oops, that's wrong, control X, they should actually be outside this particular if check just here. So separate if checks, this first if check just checks that we're finishing a line if the line is the last line we set back to beginning. Otherwise, what we do is we just increment the current index ++ so that we go into the next line. We set the current line, which is the text that we're checking, equal to the lines array at the current index. And we return input.value is equal to an empty string, so they can start with a fresh empty input for the new line. If we get to this second thing here, which means that we haven't finished a line, then what we do is we check to see if it's at least correct. If it is correct, then it stays the same color. If it's incorrect, it should change color. And so now when I save this, if I type ASD, we can see that. Then the reason that's not working is just because that is on the wrong element. So we want to set that to lowercase. So that's not working. So just let me console.log completed chars and typed chars. What is happening there? Let me refresh this page. Actually, let me go back to the main page. So that's the lyrics, that works. We go back to the main page. We'll go ASD, 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 James. So that's our lyrics for the song. We have that here. So now I type A, that is incorrect. So we're bumping into this first thing here, which actually means that I want to copy and paste that into there. So I type A. So now we can see that the reason this is incorrect is because we're getting completed things, and that's because this is comparing A to ASD, ASD. So of course it's never going to work. So what we instead want to happen is actually for the slice to be working, which it doesn't seem to be, and that's because that is an incorrect method. So now ASD, ASD, A, incorrect, recorrect, incorrect, recorrect, space ASD, new line, A, oh, wrong, but James, correct, and now we're back at the beginning. Just set that to a backup of 0. So now if I go ASD, 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 James, back at the beginning, still getting that error. Not really that big of a deal. But yeah, so that's pretty much the whole app. You see we can copy in all of these lyrics just here, as we did at the very start. We click learn, we're over here, a lazy, oh, got it wrong, rain am I, the skies refuse to cry, so on and so forth. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Like and sub if you did, leave a comment down below for what you'd like me to do next, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.